The alien coalition had been planning for decades. Their councils, a mosaic of species from across the galaxy, had watched humanity's rise with growing unease. It wasn't just the speed of their technological advancement, though that was alarming enough. It was their unpredictability. Humans were not like the others. They didn't follow the rules. They didn't respect the natural order. They adapted, improvised, and, most dangerously, they survived against all odds. The coalition had seen it before. A species that refused to be contained, that thrived in chaos. And so, they decided to act before it was too late. The blockade was their answer. A calculated, overwhelming show of force designed to cut Earth off from the stars and strangle humanity's ambitions before they could spread further. The coalition fleet was a sight to behold. Thousands of ships, sleek and menacing, formed an impenetrable ring around Earth and its colonies. Their hulls shimmered with the faint glow of advanced shielding, their weapons arrays bristling with enough firepower to reduce planets to ash. The message was clear. Humanity was to be isolated, contained, and, if necessary, eradicated. The coalition's leaders, a triumvirate of the most powerful species, stood on the bridge of their flagship, the Eclipse of Dawn, and watched as their plan unfolded. They were confident, almost smug. Humanity, for all its ingenuity, was outmatched. The blockade was flawless, their strategy unassailable. Or so they thought. On Earth, the mood was grim. The global government, a fragile alliance of nations, had been caught off guard. The coalition's arrival had been swift and silent, their ships materializing out of hyperspace without warning. Diplomatic channels were flooded with desperate pleas, but the coalition's response was cold and final. There would be no negotiations. Humanity was to remain within its borders, cut off from the interstellar trade routes that had become its lifeblood. Colonies on the fringes of human space were already feeling the strain. Supplies were running low, and communication blackouts left them isolated and afraid. The military, though formidable, was stretched thin. The coalition's numbers were simply too great. Among the chaos, Captain Alex Rider sat in the cockpit of his aging starfighter, the Starblade, and stared at the flickering holographic map of the blockade. He was a relic of a bygone era, a veteran of the interstellar wars that had defined humanity's early expansion. Once, he had been a hero, his name whispered with reverence in the halls of the military academies. But that was before the betrayal, before the mission that had cost him everything. Now, he flew solo, taking on salvage jobs and smuggling runs to keep the Starblade in the air. He was a ghost, a shadow of the man he had once been. But even ghosts could feel anger, and as Ryder watched the coalition's ships blot out the stars, he felt it burn in his chest. Ryder wasn't a man given to grand gestures or noble causes. He had seen too much, lost too much, to believe in heroes. But this was different. The coalition wasn't just threatening humanity's future. They were threatening the fragile peace Ryder had carved out for himself. And then there was the colony on Epsilon 9, a backwater outpost on the edge of human space. It wasn't much, just a handful of domes and a struggling population. But it was home to the only family Ryder had left. His sister, Mara, and her 2 children were there, trapped behind the blockade. He hadn't spoken to them in years, hadn't even tried. But now, with the coalition's noose tightening, he couldn't ignore the gnawing guilt in his gut. It was during a routine salvage mission that Ryder stumbled upon the coalition's weakness. He had been skirting the edges of the blockade, searching for derelict ships to scavenge, when his sensors picked up an anomaly. At first, he thought it was a glitch, a shadow on the edge of his scanners, too faint to be real. But as he adjusted the Starblade's systems, the shadow resolved into a pattern. The coalition's fleet, for all its size and strength, had a flaw. Their ships were arranged in a precise formation, each vessel's position calculated to maximize coverage and minimize blind spots. But there, in the heart of the blockade, was a gap, a tiny, almost imperceptible flaw in their otherwise perfect design. It was a vulnerability, a crack in the armor. And Ryder knew, with a cold certainty, that it was his only chance. He didn't bother reporting his discovery. The military brass wouldn't listen, not to him. He was a washed-up pilot with a tarnished reputation, and they had bigger problems to deal with. No, if this was going to work, he would have to do it alone. The plan formed in his mind like a puzzle snapping into place. He would infiltrate the Coalition's flagship, the Eclipse of Dawn, and disable its command and control systems. Without their central hub, the blockade would falter, giving humanity a chance to strike back. It was a suicide mission, but Ryder had stopped caring about survival a long time ago. As he plotted his course, Ryder couldn't help but laugh. It was a bitter, hollow sound, but it felt good to let it out. The Coalition had underestimated humanity, just like everyone else. They thought they could contain a species that had clawed its way out of the gravity well of its own planet, that had stared into the void and refused to blink. They thought they could break a people who had survived war, famine, and their own worst instincts. And they thought they could stop Alex Ryder, a man who had nothing left to lose. As the Starblade's engines roared to life, Ryder felt something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. The Coalition had made their move. Now it was his turn. The Starblade cut through the void like a blade through silk, its engines humming with a low, steady thrum. Ryder had spent hours recalibrating the ship systems, stripping away non-essential components to maximize speed and stealth. Every ounce of power was directed toward the engines and the cloaking device, a piece of outdated tech that he had jury-rigged to near perfection. It wouldn't hold up under close scrutiny, but it didn't need to. All he needed was a few minutes, a narrow window to slip through the Coalition's defenses and reach the Eclipse of Dawn. The flagship loomed in the distance, a monolithic structure of gleaming metal and pulsating energy. It was the heart of the blockade, the nerve center of the Coalition's operations. And it was Ryder's target. The approach was tense. Ryder's fingers danced across the controls, adjusting the ship's trajectory with surgical precision. He had memorized the patrol patterns of the Coalition's fighters, their movements predictable and rigid. They relied too much on their technology, their sensors, and not enough on instinct. Ryder had spent years flying in the black, learning to trust his gut over the cold logic of machines. It was what had kept him alive this long. As he neared the flagship, he cut the engines, letting the Starblade drift silently toward the massive ship. The cloaking device strained under the strain, its energy reserves dwindling with each passing second. Ryder held his breath, his eyes fixed on the scanner. One wrong move, one stray signal, and it would all be over. The Starblade slipped into the flagship's shadow, its hull brushing against the larger ship's docking bay doors. Ryder activated the magnetic clamps, securing his ship to the flagship's exterior. He donned his envirosuit, the worn fabric clinging to his frame like a second skin. The suit's oxygen supply was limited, but he didn't plan on being inside for long. With a final check of his gear, Ryder opened the hatch and stepped out into the void. The magnetic boots clamped onto the flagship's hull, each step sending a faint vibration through his body. The docking bay doors were sealed, but Ryder had anticipated that. He pulled a plasma cutter from his belt and went to work, the bright blue flame slicing through the metal with ease. Within minutes, he had created a hole just large enough to squeeze through. He avoided the main thoroughfares, sticking to the maintenance tunnels and service ducts that crisscrossed the ship. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet. It was the smell of alien machinery, of a civilization that had evolved far beyond humanity's understanding. But Ryder didn't have time to marvel at the technology. He had a mission to complete. The command center was located deep within the ship, a heavily fortified chamber at the heart of the flagship. Ryder had studied the schematics during his approach, memorizing every detail. He knew the layout, the security measures, the weak points, but knowing and doing were two different things. As he neared the command center, the corridors grew narrower, the security more intense. Patrols of robotic drones swept the area, their sensors scanning for any sign of intrusion. Ryder pressed himself against the wall, his heart pounding in his chest. He waited for the drones to pass, then darted forward, his movements quick and silent. The command center was just ahead, its massive doors sealed shut. Ryder pulled a small device from his belt, a portable EMP generator. He activated it and tossed it toward the doors. The device emitted a pulse of electromagnetic energy, shorting out the security systems and forcing the doors to slide open. The command center was a hive of activity, alien technicians and officers moving about with mechanical precision. Ryder slipped inside, his presence unnoticed amidst the chaos. He made his way to the central console, a towering structure of glowing panels and holographic displays. The console was the heart of the flagship systems, the key to disabling the blockade. Ryder pulled a data spike from his belt and inserted it into the console, his fingers flying across the controls. The spike was loaded with a virus, a piece of code designed to infiltrate and disrupt the Coalition systems. It was a risky move. If the virus was detected, the Coalition would lock down the entire ship, but Ryder didn't have a choice. He needed to buy humanity some time. The virus took hold, spreading through the flagship systems like a wildfire. Alarms blared, the once orderly command center descending into chaos. Ryder pulled the data spike and turned to leave, but he was too late. A squad of Coalition soldiers burst into the room, their weapons trained on him. Ryder didn't hesitate. He drew his sidearm and fired, the shots echoing through the chamber. The soldiers returned fire, their energy bolts scorching the walls and consoles. Ryder ducked behind a console, his mind racing. He was outnumbered and outgunned, but he wasn't done yet. He activated a smoke grenade, the thick cloud obscuring his movements. He used the chaos to his advantage, slipping past the soldiers and making a break for the door. The escape was a blur of adrenaline and instinct. Ryder sprinted through the corridors, the sound of pursuit close behind. He could hear the shouts of the Coalition soldiers, their alien language harsh and guttural. He didn't stop, didn't look back. He reached the docking bay and leapt through the hole he had cut earlier, his magnetic boots clamping onto the Starblade's hull. He scrambled inside, sealing the hatch behind him. The engines roared to life, the ship lurching forward as Ryder pushed it to its limits. The Coalition fighters were already in pursuit, their weapons locking onto the Starblade. Ryder maneuvered the ship with skill born of desperation, weaving through the barrage of energy bolts. The cloaking device was offline, its energy reserves depleted, but Ryder didn't need it anymore. He just needed to get clear. The Starblade shot out of the flagship's shadow, its engines blazing. Ryder's hands were steady on the controls, his focus absolute. He could see the blockade ahead, the Coalition's ships beginning to falter as the virus spread through their systems. The formation was breaking, the once impenetrable ring of ships now riddled with gaps. Ryder allowed himself a grim smile. He had done it. The blockade was weakening and humanity had a chance. But the mission wasn't over yet. The Coalition fighters were still on his tail, their weapons hot. Ryder pushed the Starblade to its limits, the ship shuddering under the strain. He just needed to hold on a little longer. As the Starblade broke through the blockade, Ryder felt a surge of triumph. He had done the impossible. He had struck a blow against the Coalition, and in doing so, he had given humanity a fighting chance. But the cost was high. The Starblade's systems were failing, its hull scorched and battered. Ryder knew he wouldn't make it back to Earth, not in this condition. But that didn't matter. He had done what he set out to do. As the ship's alarms blared and the lights flickered, Ryder leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. The stars outside the viewport were bright and endless, a reminder of the vastness of the universe. And for the first time in years, Ryder felt at peace. The Starblade drifted in the void, its engines sputtering and its hull scarred from the relentless pursuit. Ryder sat in the cockpit, his hands resting lightly on the controls, his breathing shallow but steady. The ship systems were failing one by one, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they gave out completely. But he wasn't afraid. He had done what he set out to do. The Coalition's blockade was faltering, their once impenetrable formation now riddled with gaps. Humanity had a chance, and that was enough. Outside the viewport, the stars burned with a cold, distant light. Ryder's thoughts drifted to his sister, Mara, and her children on Epsilon 9. He hadn't seen them in years, hadn't even spoken to them. The guilt of his absence weighed heavily on him, but he pushed it aside. There would be time for regrets later, if there was a later. For now, he focused on the task at hand. The Starblade's comms system was still functional, though barely. Ryder activated it, sending a coded message to the nearest human outpost. It was a simple transmission, just a string of numbers and letters, but it carried the weight of everything he had done. The message would alert the military to the blockade's weakness, giving them the opportunity they needed to strike back. As the transmission went out, Ryder leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. The cockpit was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the ship's failing systems. He allowed himself a moment of rest, his mind drifting to the past. He thought of the wars he had fought, the battles he had won and lost. He thought of the friends he had buried, the promises he had broken. And he thought of Mara, her face as clear in his mind as if she were standing beside him. She had always been the strong one, the one who held their family together. He wondered if she would forgive him for leaving, for disappearing into the black. He hoped she would. The Starblade's alarms blared, jolting Ryder from his thoughts. He opened his eyes to see a coalition fighter on the scanner, its weapons locked onto his ship. Ryder cursed under his breath and grabbed the controls, maneuvering the Starblade with the last of its strength. The fighter fired, its energy bolt streaking past the ship's hull. Ryder returned fire, his shots grazing the fighter's shields. It wasn't enough to take it down, but it bought him a few precious seconds. He pushed the Starblade to its limits, the ship shuddering under the strain. The fighter stayed on his tail, its weapons hot. Ryder knew he couldn't outrun it, not in this condition. But he didn't need to. He just needed to hold on a little longer. The Starblade's engines gave out with a final, shuddering groan. The ship drifted to a halt, its systems dead. Ryder sat in the cockpit, his hands still on the controls, his eyes fixed on the viewport. The fighter closed in, its weapons trained on the Starblade. Ryder didn't flinch. He had faced death before, and he wasn't afraid of it now. But as the fighter prepared to fire, something unexpected happened. A burst of energy streaked past the Starblade, striking the fighter and reducing it to a cloud of debris. Ryder's eyes widened as a human warship emerged from the void, its hull gleaming in the starlight. The ship's comms crackled to life, a familiar voice filling the cockpit. "This is Captain Elena Vasquez of the USS Dauntless. Captain Ryder, you've got some explaining to do." Ryder couldn't help but laugh, the sound rough and raw. Vasquez was an old friend, a fellow pilot he had served with during the wars. She was one of the few people who still believed in him, even after everything that had happened. Her presence was a welcome sight, and not just because she had saved his life. The Dauntless was a formidable ship, its weapons and shields more than a match for the Coalition's fighters. With Vasquez and her crew on his side, Ryder knew they had a chance. The Dauntless moved into position, its weapons trained on the Coalition's ships. Vasquez's voice came through the comms again, this time with a note of urgency. "Ryder, we've got your message. The blockade's weakening, but we need to act fast. Can you still fly that thing?" Ryder glanced at the Starblade's controls, his mind racing. The ship was barely holding together, but it still had some fight left in it. "I can fly," he said, his voice steady. "Just tell me where you need me." Vasquez's response was immediate. "We're going for the eclipse of dawn. If we can take out their flagship, the rest of the fleet will fall apart. But we need a distraction. Think you can handle that?" Ryder's lips curled into a grim smile. "I'll handle it." The Dauntless moved into position, its weapons firing in a coordinated barrage. The Coalition's ships scrambled to respond, their formation breaking under the assault. Ryder pushed the Starblade to its limits, the ship's engines roaring to life one last time. He flew straight for the eclipse of dawn, his ship a blur of motion. The Coalition's fighters tried to intercept him, but Ryder was too fast, too determined. He weaved through their fire, his movements precise and calculated. The eclipse of dawn loomed ahead, its massive hull a testament to the Coalition's power. But Ryder didn't falter. He had faced worse odds before, and he wasn't about to back down now. As the Starblade closed in on the flagship, Ryder activated the ship's remaining weapons. The Starblade's cannons fired, their shots striking the eclipse of dawn's hull with pinpoint accuracy. The flagship's shields flickered and failed, its systems overloaded by the virus Ryder had planted earlier. The Dauntless moved in for the kill, its weapons tearing through the flagship's hull. The Eclipse of Dawn shuddered and broke apart, its massive structure collapsing in on itself. The Coalition's fleet, now leaderless and disorganized, began to retreat. The blockade was broken. Ryder watched as the Coalition's ships fled, their once impenetrable formation now in disarray. The Dauntless moved to intercept them, its weapons firing in a final, decisive barrage. Ryder allowed himself a moment of triumph, but it was short-lived. The Starblade's systems were failing, its hull cracking under the strain. He knew he couldn't hold on much longer. As the ship's alarms blared and the lights flickered, Ryder leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. The stars outside the viewport were bright and endless, a reminder of the vastness of the universe. And for the first time in years, Ryder felt at peace. The Dauntless moved into position, its tractor beams latching onto the Starblade. Vasquez's voice came through the comms, her tone softer now. "We've got you, Ryder. You're not done yet." Ryder smiled, his eyes still closed. "Thanks, Elena. I owe you one." As the Starblade was pulled into the Dauntless hangar, Ryder allowed himself to relax. The mission was over, but the fight was far from finished. Humanity had a chance, and Ryder intended to make the most of it. For Mara, for her children, and for everyone else who had been trapped behind the blockade. The stars outside the viewport were bright and endless, a reminder of the vastness of the universe. And for the first time in years, Ryder felt at peace.